What do you do when a place meant for quick errands and everyday convenience becomes the most dangerous location in an entire neighborhood? What do you do when a simple corner store, a place designed for snacks, drinks, and routine stops, becomes the center of 41 shootings and 4 deaths? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what do you do when all of this happens directly across the street from a police station? This is the story of how an ordinary convenience store in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, transformed into a grinding cycle of violence that left the community terrified and authorities with no choice but to intervene. Before we go any further, if stories like this pull you in, if you want real crime told without exaggeration, without shortcuts, and without looking away from uncomfortable truths, then this is your space. Subscribe to Real Crime Saga and stay with us, because the most dangerous stories are often the ones hiding in plain sight. Baton Rouge is a city with a complicated relationship with crime. It is not unfamiliar with violence, but it is also a city of neighborhoods, families, routines, and everyday life continuing in the shadow of those realities. Like many American cities, crime here is not evenly spread. It clusters, it repeats, it settles into certain spaces and refuses to leave. And sometimes, those spaces are not dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes, they're brightly lit businesses that never close. The convenience store at the center of this story did not begin as a place of fear. At first glance, it looked like hundreds of others scattered across the city. A small building, open late, selling basic necessities to anyone who walked in. It existed quietly, blending into the rhythm of the neighborhood. People stopped by on their way home. Some grabbed food. Others lingered. No one expected it to become what it would eventually represent. But over time, something shifted. Police calls to the area increased. Arguments turned violent. Gunfire became familiar. What should have been isolated incidents began to follow a pattern. The same location, the same parking lot, the same address appearing again and again in police reports. Each shooting added to a growing list that no business should ever be associated with, let alone one positioned so close to law enforcement. 41 shootings is not an accident. For deaths are not coincidence. They are indicators of a deeper problem, one that raises an uncomfortable question. How could this level of violence persist for so long? How could it grow unchecked in full view of a city and across from a police station? And at what point does a business stop being a neutral space and start becoming a catalyst for crime? This case is not just about gun violence. It is about environment, about neglect, about how certain places can become magnets for danger when warning signs are ignored. It is about a community forced to live with fear night after night, and a justice system that eventually had to confront an uncomfortable truth. That truth is this: sometimes crime is not hidden. Sometimes it operates openly, protected by routine and familiarity, until the damage becomes impossible to ignore. In this story, we will trace how an ordinary convenience store became a symbol of everything that went wrong in one Baton Rouge neighborhood. We will look at the violence, the lives lost, the frustration of residents, and the moment authorities finally decided that enough was enough. Because when violence becomes routine and death becomes expected, intervention is no longer optional. And this store would soon become a line the city could no longer allow to be crossed. Next, we begin where this story truly takes shape. How an ordinary neighborhood business quietly drifted from convenience into chaos. Before it became a symbol of fear and violence, the convenience store was simply part of the neighborhood's routine. It was the kind of place people barely thought about. A stop made out of habit rather than intention. Somewhere you went when you needed milk late at night, a cold drink on a hot afternoon, or a quick snack without driving far. It existed quietly, woven into the everyday lives of the people who lived nearby. In the early days, there was nothing about the store that suggested danger. The building was unremarkable. The sign was plain. The doors opened and closed at all hours, just like countless other convenience stores across Baton Rouge. Parents sent their kids there for small errands. Workers stopped by after long shifts. Neighbors passed through without a second thought. It was familiar, predictable, and forgettable in the way ordinary places often are. The The store's presence made sense. It served a practical purpose in a residential area where people needed access to basic items at all times of the day. It wasn't flashy. It didn't attract attention. It didn't stand out as a trouble spot. To the casual observer, it was just another small business trying to stay afloat in a competitive environment. And that is what made its transformation so unsettling. There were no warning signs posted on the walls, no visible security barricades, no obvious evidence of violence. In its early years, the store looked exactly like what it claimed to be: a place of convenience, a neutral space, a business that existed to meet everyday needs. Even its location, directly across from a police station, added to the sense of safety. People assumed that anything happening there would be quickly noticed and handled. That assumption created a dangerous comfort. At first, there were no headlines, no community meetings, no urgent calls for action. Small disturbances were brushed aside as isolated incidents, the kind that happen anywhere people gather. Arguments, raised voices, occasional police presence that didn't seem unusual in a city accustomed to crime statistics and sirens in the distance. Nothing that suggested the store itself would become a focal point for something far worse. What people did not realize was that the store was slowly changing, not in appearance, but in function. It began to attract the wrong kind of attention. Certain individuals started lingering longer than necessary. The parking lot became a meeting point rather than a pass-through space. The atmosphere shifted subtly at first, in ways that are easy to miss when change happens gradually. Still, from the outside, nothing looked wrong. This is how dangerous places often begin. Not with chaos, but with normalcy, with routine, with familiarity that lowers suspicion and delays concern. The store did not suddenly become violent overnight. It drifted there, unnoticed, while life continued around it. Families still lived nearby. Cars still passed. Customers still came and went. But beneath that normal surface, a different purpose was forming. The store was becoming more than a place to shop. It was becoming a place to gather, to wait, to settle disputes, to conduct business that had nothing to do with snacks or groceries. And because it looked ordinary, it was allowed to exist without scrutiny. That is what makes the beginning of this story so important. Because when violence finally erupted in full force, many people would look back and realize that the warning signs had not been dramatic. They had been quiet, subtle, easy to dismiss. The store had not announced its descent into danger. It had simply changed roles while everyone was looking elsewhere. And by the time the shift became impossible to ignore, the damage was already underway. The change did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when the convenience store crossed a clear line from ordinary business into something dangerous. Instead, the descent was gradual, unfolding quietly over time, the way serious problems often do. It began with whispers. Neighbors noticed unfamiliar faces lingering longer than necessary. Cars parked in a lot without anyone going inside. Groups gathered late into the night, not shopping, not leaving, just waiting. At first, it was easy to dismiss. In a city like Baton Rouge, people are used to activity around convenience stores at all hours. Late-night conversations, people hanging around after closing time. None of it seemed unusual enough to demand attention. But slowly, the atmosphere began to change. The store was no longer just a place people passed through. It became a place people stayed. Word started to spread within the neighborhood. The store had become a meeting point for illicit activity. People whispered about drug transactions happening just out of sight, about dice games set up behind the building or in nearby corners of a lot, about money changing hands in ways that had nothing to do with legitimate business. These were not confirmed facts at first, but patterns observed by those who lived nearby and watched the same behaviors repeat night after night. With those gatherings came tension. Arguments broke out more frequently. Voices were raised. Fights spilled into the parking lot. Some incidents ended with bruises and injuries. Others ended with police arriving to break things up, only for the same cycle to resume hours later. The store's role was shifting, not because of what it sold, but because of what it allowed to happen around it. The violence did not begin with gunfire. It began with confrontations. Physical altercations that left people bloodied but alive. Disputes over money. Arguments tied to gambling. Conflicts that started small and escalated quickly. Each incident chipped away at the idea that the store was neutral ground. It was becoming a place where unresolved disputes found an audience and an outlet. As these incidents increased, so did fear among residents. Parents warned their children to stay away. People avoided the area after dark. The store's parking lot, once a place of convenience, began to feel like a trap. But still, the business remained open. The doors stayed unlocked. The lights stayed on. What made the situation worse was how predictable it became. The same individuals appeared again and again. The same arguments followed similar patterns. Law enforcement was called repeatedly, but the response felt temporary. Officers arrived, dispersed the crowd, filed reports, and left. And within hours, the gathering returned. This repetition gave the store a new identity. It was no longer just a business operating within the neighborhood. It had become a known hub for criminal behavior, a place where disputes were settled not with words, but with fists, where illegal activities were tolerated, if not outright ignored, where the atmosphere itself encouraged escalation. The transition was subtle but significant. The store no longer felt like a place that belonged to the community. It felt like a space that had been taken over, a location that attracted conflict rather than convenience. And once that perception took hold, it spread quickly. Residents began to understand something important. The store was no longer just hosting criminal activity. It was facilitating it by providing a consistent gathering place, a stage, a setting where tensions could build without interruption. This realization marked a turning point, because once a location becomes known as a place where rules are relaxed and behavior goes unchecked, violence becomes inevitable. And that inevitability was about to reveal itself in the most irreversible way. When the first gunshot rang out near the convenience store, it shattered whatever illusion of control still remained. This was no longer about arguments or physical fights that could be broken up and forgotten. Gunfire changed everything. It announced, unmistakably, that the situation had crossed into a far more dangerous territory. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. The shootings did not begin as a single dramatic event. They emerged as the natural consequence of rising tension that had been building for months. Disputes that once ended in shouting or fists now ended with weapons being drawn. Money disagreements turned deadly. Gambling arguments escalated. Territorial conflicts followed people to the store because it had become a known meeting place, a location where rivals expected to find each other. These shootings did not happen in a vacuum. Many of them were tied to gang activity, where personal grudges and territorial disputes played out in public view. Others stemmed from arguments fueled by alcohol, drugs, or desperation. Some were targeted attacks. Others were chaotic moments where bullets flew without regard for whom might be standing nearby. In several cases, it was never entirely clear who the intended target was, only that someone pulled a trigger in a crowded space. The parking lot became the most dangerous part of the property. Cars idled as people argued. Groups gathered too close. Weapons were produced with alarming ease. Shots were fired, and then silence, followed by sirens. Police responded again and again. Officers arrived to secure scenes, collect shell casings, speak to witnesses who often said little, and file reports that would soon blur together. Each response looked similar to the last. The same address, the same location, the same pattern repeating itself with disturbing consistency. 41 shootings did not happen by chance. They happened because the conditions were allowed to persist, because the store remained open and active even as violence became routine, because those involved knew the location would draw the same people, the same conflicts, and the same opportunities for confrontation. Over time, the store stopped being a backdrop for violence and became a magnet for it. Residents learned to recognize the signs. Raised voices followed by sudden silence. Cars speeding away. Police lights reflecting off nearby houses in the early hours of the morning. The community lived in anticipation of the next incident, knowing it was only a matter of time. What made the situation even more alarming was how often innocent people were placed at risk. Not every shooting involved people who were part of criminal disputes. Bullets do not respect boundaries. They do not distinguish between participants and bystanders. Anyone in the area could be caught in the wrong moment, standing in the wrong place when a dispute turned deadly. With each shooting, frustration grew. Residents questioned why the store was still operating as usual, why the same location kept producing the same violence, why police responses felt reactive rather than preventative. The proximity of the store to a police station only intensified those questions. How could this keep happening in such plain view? The pattern was impossible to ignore. Officers knew the address by heart. Dispatch logs filled with repeated calls. Investigators began to see the store not as an incidental location, but as a consistent factor in the violence. This was no longer about individual crimes. It was about an environment that allowed them to thrive. As the shootings accumulated, something shifted within law enforcement and city officials. The question was no longer whether the store was connected to the violence. It was how long the city could allow it to continue. And then the shootings turned fatal. As the shootings continued to pile up, the violence surrounding the convenience store reached a point where it could no longer be measured only in statistics or police reports. It became personal. It became irreversible. For people lost their lives in incidents tied to this location. And with each death, the reality of what the store had become grew heavier, more impossible to ignore. The first death sent shock through the neighborhood. Up until that moment, many residents had clung to the belief that the violence, while frightening, might remain survivable, that people would get hurt but not killed. That assumption died along with the first victim. Word spread quickly. Families whispered about it in their homes. Parents pulled their children closer. The store's name was no longer spoken casually. It was spoken with fear. That loss raised immediate questions. How could someone die in connection to a place that was still operating as if nothing had changed? How could a business continue serving customers when its surroundings had already claimed a life? For the family of the victim, grief was joined by anger. Their loss felt preventable. Their pain felt unnecessary. And their questions had no satisfying answers. Then came another death. This time, the shock turned into dread. The pattern was no longer theoretical. 2 lives gone meant something was deeply wrong. Neighbors began to connect the dots, seeing what law enforcement and city officials would soon have to confront. The store was not just near crime. It was entangled in it. Each death reinforced that reality, pulling the community deeper into fear and frustration. By the time the third death occurred, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed completely. People no longer debated whether the store was dangerous. They debated how long it would take before someone else was killed. Candlelight vigils and quiet memorials appeared. Conversations shifted from disbelief to resignation. Residents felt trapped in a situation they did not create but were forced to endure. The fourth death broke whatever patience remained. For lives lost in connection to one location was no longer something that could be rationalized away. Families demanded answers. Neighbors demanded action. Even those who had once stayed silent began to speak out. The emotional toll spread far beyond those directly affected. Fear became part of daily life. People altered their routines. Some avoided the area entirely. Others felt unsafe even inside their own homes. The store's presence began to weigh on the community like a constant reminder of what had been taken. Each life lost represented a future erased. A family altered forever. Children growing up without parents. Parents burying children. These were not abstract consequences. They were lived realities unfolding in real time. Authorities could no longer treat the situation as a series of unrelated incidents. Death changes how violence is perceived. It transforms patterns into warnings. It forces institutions to act where hesitation once existed. With 4 deaths tied to one address, the stakes became undeniable. The emotional impact was matched by a social one. Trust eroded. Residents questioned whether their safety mattered. Weather warning signs were being ignored because the victims did not fit a certain profile. The store became a symbol of neglect, not just crime. This human cost shifted the conversation. It was no longer about convenience or business rights. It was about lives lost and whether the city would allow more. After the fourth death, silence was no longer an option. Fear had been building for months, but now it overflowed into anger, frustration, and a deep sense of betrayal. The community surrounding the convenience store reached a breaking point. Neighbors who had once kept their concerns private began speaking openly. Families who had tried to adapt to the danger realized adaptation was no longer enough. Residents talked to each other in low voices at first, sharing stories of close calls and sleepless nights. Parents described keeping their children indoors long after the sun went down. Elderly residents spoke about feeling trapped in their own homes, listening to arguments outside, and waiting for the sound of gunfire that had become disturbingly familiar. Fear was no longer abstract. It was lived. As voices grew louder, so did frustration. People began asking why the store was still open. Why, after dozens of shootings and multiple deaths, nothing had changed. The proximity of the police station only intensified these questions. To many residents, it felt like violence was happening in full view, yet no one was stepping in to stop it. That sense of abandonment cut deeply. Community meetings became tense. Emotions ran high. Some residents demanded immediate closure of the store, seeing it as the root of the problem. Others expressed skepticism, arguing that crime existed everywhere and that shutting down one business would not fix deeper issues. These opposing views created friction within the neighborhood itself, adding another layer of strain to an already fragile environment. For those who felt unsafe, the issue was no longer theoretical. They were living with the consequences. They spoke about bullet holes found nearby, about stray gunfire waking them in the night, about avoiding certain streets entirely. Their anger was not directed only at the store, but at a system they believed had allowed the situation to spiral out of control. There was also resentment toward those who seemed unaffected. Some people continued to shop at the store, treating it as just another business. That indifference fueled tension. To families who feared for their lives, this felt like denial, like choosing convenience over safety, like pretending nothing was wrong when everything clearly was. Frustration mounted as calls for action went unanswered. Residents reported feeling dismissed or ignored. Complaints were filed. Concerns were raised. But days turned into weeks, and the store remained open. Each passing day, without change, felt like another message that the community's safety was not a priority. The emotional weight of the situation was exhausting. Living in constant anticipation of violence takes a toll. Anxiety became routine. Trust in local leadership eroded. People questioned whether it would take another death to force meaningful action. This collective pressure began to shift the conversation beyond the neighborhood. City officials and law enforcement could no longer ignore the growing unrest. The situation was no longer just about crime statistics. It was about public trust, accountability, and whether authorities were willing to confront a problem that had become politically and legally complicated. The community's reaction marked a turning point. Fear had transformed into demand. Silence had become voice, and that voice was growing too loud to ignore. By the time the community's frustration reached its peak, law enforcement had already been watching the pattern quietly take shape. Every shooting, every violent call, every emergency response left behind a record. And when those records were placed side by side, they told a story that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. The same address appeared again and again. The same parking lot, the same store. Authorities began to take a closer look, not just at individual crimes, but the volume and consistency of violence tied to that single location. Dispatch logs showed hundreds of police responses over time. Officers had been called repeatedly for shootings, fights, disturbances, and disorderly conduct. Crime scene tape had become a familiar sight. The store's address had become one officers recognized instantly. This was no longer normal. Police officers are trained to respond to crime, but they are also trained to recognize patterns. And the pattern here was unmistakable. The store was not simply near violent incidents. It was present in nearly all of them. Every time investigators mapped out crime scenes, the same location sat at the center like a gravitational pull. Prosecutors were brought into the conversation as the scale of the problem became undeniable. They reviewed years of incident reports, emergency calls, and case files. What they saw was not a random cluster of violence, but a sustained and predictable cycle. The store operated as a consistent gathering place where disputes escalated and weapons were introduced. The environment around it allowed conflict to grow rather than dissolve. This realization changed how authorities framed the problem. Instead of focusing solely on individual offenders, investigators began examining the role the location itself played. Why did conflicts keep converging there? Why did people involved in criminal activity repeatedly return to the same spot? Why did violence erupt there at a rate far exceeding surrounding areas? The answer, they believed, lay in the store's atmosphere and operation. The business had become a known hangout. Its layout, hours, and lack of effective oversight created a space where loitering thrived. Disputes were allowed to linger. Illegal activities were tolerated or overlooked. That environment did not create criminals, but it gave them a stage. And that stage was producing deadly consequences. Police realized that traditional responses were not working. Arrests were made, reports were filed, but the violence kept returning. Each intervention treated symptoms, not the source. Prosecutors began discussing a different approach, one that targeted the conditions allowing crime to flourish rather than chasing each incident after the fact. This was a significant shift. Instead of asking who committed each crime, authorities began asking why so many crimes were connected to one place. That question opened the door to a legal strategy that went beyond patrol cars and arrests. It pointed toward accountability at a structural level. Investigators concluded that as long as the store continued operating in the same manner, the cycle of violence would continue. The data supported it. The history supported it. The community's experience supported it. For the first time, the focus moved away from reacting to violence and toward preventing it. That shift marked the beginning of a legal battle that would determine whether the city had the authority to shut down a business in the name of public safety. And once that door was opened, there was no going back. Once police and prosecutors reached the conclusion that the violence surrounding the convenience store was not accidental, the case moved into unfamiliar territory. This was no longer about making arrests or increasing patrols. It became a question of whether the city could legally intervene in the operation of a private business in order to protect public safety. That question would ignite a legal battle with serious implications. Prosecutors began building their case around a concept rarely discussed outside courtrooms: public nuisance. In legal terms, a public nuisance is not about a single crime or a single victim. It is about a condition that endangers an entire community. Prosecutors argued that the store, through its operation and environment, had crossed that line. It was no longer just a place where crime happened nearby. It had become a place where crime repeatedly originated, escalated, and spread. To support their claim, prosecutors presented a timeline that stretched back years. They documented dozens of shootings, multiple deaths, and an overwhelming number of police responses tied directly to the store's address. This was not about isolated incidents separated by time or circumstance. It was about a consistent pattern that followed the store wherever it operated. The government's argument was clear. The store's business practices, hours of operation, tolerance of loitering, and failure to deter illegal activity had created an environment that encouraged violence. Prosecutors emphasized that they were not accusing the store of pulling triggers or committing crimes directly. Instead, they argued that the store had become a catalyst, a space where disputes were allowed to simmer and explode, where illegal gatherings went unchecked, and where violence became normalized. From the city's perspective, continuing to allow the store to operate as it had meant accepting that more people would be hurt or killed. That was a risk they claimed they could no longer justify. The store's owner strongly resisted this narrative. In response, The defense argued that the store was being unfairly blamed for problems rooted in broader social issues. Poverty, crime, gang activity, and systemic failures, they claimed, existed throughout Baton Rouge. Shutting down one convenience store, they argued, would not solve those problems. According to the owner, the business was being used as a scapegoat for issues far beyond its control. The defense maintained that criminals chose the location, not the other way around. That the store did not invite violence, but simply existed in a neighborhood already struggling with crime. They argued that holding the business responsible set a dangerous precedent, one that could punish legitimate owners for problems created by society at large. This clash revealed a deeper tension. On one side stood a community exhausted by fear and loss, supported by prosecutors who believed drastic action was necessary. On the other stood a business owner defending property rights and warning against oversimplifying complex social issues. The courtroom became a space where those competing realities collided. The judge was tasked with answering a difficult question. At what point does a business lose the protection of neutrality? When does repeated violence turn from coincidence into responsibility? And how much blood must be spilled before public safety outweighs private operation? This legal battle was not just about one store. It was about defining the limits of tolerance, about deciding whether a city had the authority to intervene before more lives were lost. As arguments unfolded, one truth remained unavoidable. Regardless of intent, the store had become inseparable from the violence surrounding it, and the court would soon have to decide whether that connection justified shutting its doors. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, it carried a weight that extended far beyond the courtroom. After years of violence, dozens of shootings, and 4 lives lost, the decision marked a turning point that many in the community had long waited for. The convenience store was ordered to shut down for 5 years. Not temporarily, not conditionally, fully closed, based on the conclusion that its operation had become inseparable from the violence surrounding it. This type of ruling was rare. Courts do not easily close businesses, especially ones that have operated openly for years. Property rights, economic considerations, and legal precedent typically make such decisions difficult. But in this case, the judge agreed with prosecutors that the store had crossed a critical threshold. The volume of violence linked to the location was not incidental. It was excessive, persistent, and dangerous. Allowing the store to continue operating under the same conditions was deemed an unacceptable risk to public safety. The ruling sent a clear message. The court was no longer willing to treat the store as a passive backdrop for crime. It was being held accountable for the environment it had created and maintained. The injunction did not accuse the business of committing violence, but it acknowledged that its presence and operation had fueled it. For many residents, the decision felt surreal. The store had been there for so long that it seemed untouchable. Its closure represented something new, something firm. It signaled that the city was finally willing to draw a line. The order required the store to vacate the property within a specified period. This was not an immediate shutdown with police escorting people out. It was a controlled closure, allowing time for the business to clear out inventory and leave the space. But the outcome was unavoidable. The doors would close, and they would remain closed. The ruling also placed strict conditions on any potential future use of the property. Reopening as a similar business would require approvals, oversight, and safety measures that address the issues at the heart of the case. The message was unmistakable. The days of operating without accountability were over. What made the ruling so significant was not just the closure itself, but what it represented. It showed that a business could be legally challenged and shut down when it became a consistent threat to public safety. It set a precedent that location and environment matter, that repeated violence cannot be brushed aside as coincidence forever. The decision also acknowledged the toll taken on the community. Years of fear, sleepless nights, and grief had finally been recognized by the justice system. For families who had lost loved ones, the ruling did not bring closure in the emotional sense, but it offered something else: validation. The store's closure marked the end of a chapter defined by bloodshed and neglect. But it also raised new questions. Would the violence simply move elsewhere? Would the absence of the store create lasting change? Or was this only the first step in addressing deeper problems? When the convenience store finally closed its doors, the neighborhood did not erupt into celebration. The reaction was quieter than that, more complicated. For many residents, the first feeling was relief, a deep exhale after years of living on edge. Nights grew calmer. The familiar tension that came with raised voices and sudden sirens began to fade. For the first time in a long while, people felt that something had shifted. But relief was only part of the story. The closure forced the community to sit with mixed emotions. Some residents felt vindicated, believing their fears and frustrations had finally been acknowledged. Others felt uneasy, wondering why it had taken so long and why lives had to be lost before action was taken. The sense of safety returning to the area was real, but it came with the weight of what had already happened. Families who lived nearby began to reclaim parts of their routines. People walked past the property without rushing. Parents felt more comfortable letting children play outside again. Neighbors spoke about sleeping through the night without being startled awake by gunshots. These changes were subtle, but meaningful. They marked the beginning of healing. At the same time, a new debate emerged. Some questioned whether closing one business truly addressed the root of the problem. Crime does not exist in isolation, and many worried that the violence would simply move elsewhere, that shutting down the store might displace the issue rather than solve it. These concerns were not unfounded. Cities across the country have seen similar patterns, where crime migrates when pressure is applied to one location. Others argued that even if crime did shift, removing a known hotspot was still a necessary step, that preventing violence in one place mattered, even if broader challenges remained. For them, the closure was not a final solution, but a meaningful intervention, a way to stop the bleeding, even if the wound required deeper treatment. The absence of the store changed the neighborhood's rhythm. The parking lot that once served as a gathering point for conflict sat empty. The late-night traffic disappeared. The constant presence of strangers gave way to familiarity again. People noticed how much space the store had taken up in their lives, not physically but emotionally. The property itself became a reminder, a quiet structure holding the memory of what once happened there. Some residents avoided looking at it. Others saw it as a symbol of progress, proof that change, however delayed, was possible. Conversations shifted from fear to cautious optimism. Law enforcement continued monitoring the area, aware that long-term change requires consistency. Community leaders discussed ways to prevent similar situations from developing elsewhere. The closure sparked broader conversations about accountability, prevention, and how early intervention might save lives in the future. The neighborhood did not suddenly become perfect. Challenges remained, but the sense of being trapped eased. The feeling that danger was inevitable began to loosen its grip. This chapter of the story showed something important. That environments matter, that places can shape behavior, and that removing one harmful influence can create room for recovery, even if it does not erase the past. To understand why this case mattered so much, it has to be placed within the wider reality of Baton Rouge itself. Like many American cities, Baton Rouge has struggled with violent crime for years, but has also seen periods of progress. In recent years, overall shooting numbers in parts of the city had begun to decline. Law enforcement strategies, community programs, and increased awareness had contributed to gradual improvements. The narrative, at least on paper, suggested movement in the right direction. And yet, this convenience store stood out. While broader trends showed signs of stabilization, violence continued to cluster around this one location with alarming consistency. 41 shootings tied to a single address did not reflect the direction the city was trying to move in. Instead, it exposed a contradiction. Progress can exist alongside neglect. Improvement at a citywide level does not guarantee safety everywhere. This store became an outlier in the worst possible way. It highlighted how crime does not spread evenly. It concentrates where conditions allow it to. While some neighborhoods benefited from reduced violence, others were left to endure environments where warning signs were ignored. This case revealed a critical truth about crime trends. Numbers can go down overall, while specific places remain dangerously unchanged. The store's persistence as a hotspot forced officials to confront something uncomfortable. That violence is not always about sudden spikes or citywide crises. Sometimes, it is about what happens when an ordinary space is allowed to quietly decay. When small issues are overlooked because they do not immediately register as emergencies. When routine replaces vigilance. Ordinary spaces are powerful. They shape how people gather, interact, and resolve conflict. A convenience store is not supposed to be a battleground. It is meant to be neutral ground. But when oversight fades and accountability disappears, neutrality erodes. The space begins to serve a different purpose. This case showed how easily that transformation can happen. The store did not announce its change. It did not suddenly become violent. It drifted there over time. Loitering became normal. Illegal activity became tolerated. Disputes were allowed to linger. Each unaddressed issue layered onto the next, until the environment itself began producing violence. That is what made this situation so dangerous. The store's appearance never changed. It continued to look ordinary, familiar, safe to the untrained eye. But beneath that surface, it had become a magnet for conflict. And because it looked normal, it was allowed to remain. This is the risk cities face when they focus only on statistics and not on patterns. When they celebrate overall improvement without addressing localized harm. The Baton Rouge case demonstrates that progress is fragile. It can be undermined by ignoring places that quietly accumulate risk. The closure of the store was not just about stopping violence at one address. It was about recognizing how environments contribute to crime. About understanding that public safety is not only about responding to incidents, but about identifying and dismantling the conditions that make them likely. As the city moved forward, this case served as a warning. That dangerous spaces do not always look dangerous. That ordinary places can become lethal when left unchecked. And that waiting for numbers to spike before acting can cost lives. Even after the doors were closed and the violence quieted, the story did not end neatly. What remained were questions. Heavy ones. Questions that refused to fade simply because a ruling had finally been made. Questions that lingered in the minds of residents, families of victims, law enforcement, and anyone who followed the case closely. The first and most difficult question was also the most obvious. Why did it take so many incidents before action happened? 41 shootings did not occur overnight. For deaths were not sudden or unpredictable. The violence unfolded over time, in full view of the community and within reach of authorities. Each incident was documented. Each police response was recorded. And yet, meaningful intervention came only after the situation became impossible to ignore. For many residents, this delay felt like a failure of urgency, a sense that danger had to reach an extreme level before it was taken seriously. This raises an uncomfortable truth about how systems often work. Action is frequently reactive rather than preventative. Problems are tolerated until they become crises. In this case, the threshold for action appeared to be loss of life, not the warning signs that preceded it. That reality left families wondering whether earlier intervention could have spared them their grief. Which leads to the next question. Could the violence have been prevented earlier? Looking back, it is difficult to argue that there were no warning signs. Repeated disturbances, escalating confrontations, the same location appearing in police reports again and again. These were not subtle indicators. They were clear patterns forming in real time. Many residents believed that stricter oversight, earlier enforcement, or even temporary restrictions could have disrupted the cycle before it turned deadly. Prevention, however, requires foresight and accountability. It requires acknowledging that environments matter and that businesses do not exist in isolation from the communities around them. In this case, that acknowledgement came late, and the cost of that delay was measured in lives. The final question may be the most complex. What does this case say about how crime is tied to social and structural issues? The store did not exist in a vacuum. It operated in a neighborhood shaped by broader challenges. Poverty, limited resources, systemic inequality, and long-standing crime patterns all played a role. Violence did not originate solely because of one business, but the business became a focal point where those issues converged. This case illustrates how crime is rarely the result of a single factor. It grows where oversight is weak, where accountability is inconsistent, and where environments allow harmful behavior to thrive. Shutting down the store addressed an immediate danger, but it did not erase the conditions that made that danger possible in the first place. That is what makes the story so unsettling. It forces us to confront the gap between knowing a problem exists and acting decisively to stop it. It exposes how systems can normalize risk when it develops slowly. And it challenges the idea that crime can always be managed by responding after harm has already occurred. The closure of the store answered one question, but opened many others. About responsibility, about prevention, about how many warnings are enough, and about how many lives must be disrupted or lost before action is taken. These questions do not have easy answers, but they matter, because ignoring them means accepting that similar situations will unfold again in different neighborhoods, at different addresses, behind doors that still look ordinary from the outside. This story began with something ordinary. A convenience store doing what convenience stores everywhere are meant to do. Serving a neighborhood, blending into daily routines, existing without attention. Nothing about it suggested danger at first, and that is exactly how the cycle began. Familiarity created comfort. Comfort delayed concern, and concern came far too late. Over time, that ordinary space transformed into something else entirely. It became a gathering point for illicit activity, then a place where disputes escalated, then a location defined by gunfire. 41 shootings tied to a single address were not a coincidence. They were a warning that went unheeded for too long. And when 4 people lost their lives, the cost of inaction became undeniable. The human toll changed everything. Families were left grieving. A community lived in fear. Trust in systems meant to protect people began to erode. Violence was no longer an abstract problem discussed in reports or statistics. It was personal, it was visible, and it was happening again and again in the same place. That reality forced authorities to confront a difficult truth. Traditional responses were not working. Arrests and patrols alone could not break the cycle because the environment itself had become part of the problem. The store was no longer neutral ground. It had evolved into a catalyst for harm. The legal intervention that followed was rare and controversial. Declaring a business a public nuisance and ordering its closure for 5 years was not a routine decision. It was an acknowledgement that safety sometimes requires stepping beyond conventional boundaries. That when environments repeatedly produce violence, they must be addressed directly, even if doing so challenges assumptions about property and operation. The closure marked the end of a long chapter defined by fear and loss. It did not undo the damage. It did not bring back the lives lost, but it did something essential. It stopped the cycle. It removed a known danger from the community and allowed space for healing to begin. This case reminds us of something uncomfortable but necessary. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly inside ordinary places. It hides behind routine and familiarity. And when warning signs are ignored, the cost can be devastating. Justice and community safety do not always come from familiar solutions. Sometimes they require unconventional action, the courage to intervene, the willingness to confront problems at their source rather than reacting after harm is done. The story of this Baton Rouge convenience store is not just about crime. It is about responsibility, about recognizing patterns before they become tragedies, about understanding that places shape behavior, and that ignoring those dynamics can cost lives. Thank you for staying with this story. If this case made you pause, reflect, or see everyday spaces differently, that is exactly why Real Crime Saga exists. to tell the stories that remind us to look closer, ask harder questions, and never underestimate how quickly the ordinary can become dangerous. Until next time, stay aware.